co-sponsors, City Council Lydia Edwards. We're also going to be joined momentarily from Council President and also co-sponsor, and that's Councilor Andrea Campbell. We are here today to discuss Docket 0188. It's an ordinance relative to the establishment of an independent commission on equal opportunity and elimination of systemic bias in the workplace. And this matter, also Councilor Zakem as well. We had a suspension of the rules, and we had a third sponsor, City Councilor Josh Zakem, who I know just stepped out. He'll be back momentarily. The proposed commission, at the request of the mayor and/or by a majority vote of the City Council, can initiate an independent review of the city department in question, establish standards and protocols for the request or call for an independent investigation, set internal rules and procedures that will govern the commission itself, exercise subpoena power, and issue binding policy orders to a city department. I'd like to note that this is being streamlined on Boston City Council TV online. It's also being recorded and broadcast on Comcast Channel 8 and RCN Channel 82 and Verizon 1964. Anyone in attendance that wishes to offer public testimony may do so by signing the sheet as you come into the chamber. And I know that we have two panelists. One of us with us here is Evandro Carvalho, the Executive Director of Boston Human Rights Commission and a former state representative from Dorchester and a colleague of ours. So welcome to the Ionella Chambers, Evandro. And we're going to turn it over to the lead sponsors now for an opening comment. City Councilor Lydia Edwards, who will be followed by City Councilor Josh Zakem, and then hopefully our Council President will be back in time to offer offer opening comments. Chair recognizes Councilor Lydia Edwards.
Thank you, Chairman Flaherty. Today I wanted to just to reframe the initiative and the goals of this conversation now that we have this. When I initially thought about this independent commission, it was due to frustration of the way in which we handle discrimination investigations in the city of Boston. In that particular case, it had to do with the Boston Fire Department, but we have heard about different departments where there are allegations of discrimination, and that doesn't make us unique as a city any place. There are issues in every single city. But the ability to independently, efficiently handle those issues and to not just see them as a one-on-one issue, but as one that is part of a system or systemic bias is something that I think the city of Boston should take the lead. And when I initially filed this and thought of this, I thought we needed an independent commission that could not only look at the issues on an individual basis, but figure out what the systems in place that cause those results, and then ultimately turn around and monitor any remedy that we had come up with. And we've had at least 4 reports now on the Boston Fire Department, and we still have 15 women out of 1,500 firefighters. Now, and the individual treatment of those individuals has varied, but there has been far too many allegations and concerns of sexism and racism. So right now, having heard in Mayor Walsh's State of the City, his call to revamp the Human Rights Commission, I at first was skeptical in terms of whether that was an attempt to prevent this commission, but when I further researched the HRC, its role, I became very excited. And so at this point, I want the conversation to be about how a lot of the goals of this independent commission are met by a vibrant, fully funded Human Rights Commission. And so today we invited not only our new, I'm going to get your title wrong, sir, Commissioner? I'm sorry.
Executive Director.
Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission, Mr. Carvalho, but also we invited Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and also Civil Rights Attorney Rebecca Ponticas to come and testify about the best practices in making this the most vibrant, most accessible, most effective Human Rights Commission. I hope from this conversation to be very satisfied that what we have in Boston will be built upon and be strengthened versus trying to set up an independent commission. I can't speak for my co-sponsors or of this particular ordinance, but I'm excited about what we can do with what we have. So I just wanted to state that for the record. So in terms of the independent commission, I'm excited about making this Human Rights Commission the best it can be.
Chair is City Councilor Josh Zakem.
Thank you, Mr.
Sponsor.
Chairman. I want to thank my good colleagues, Councilors Edwards and Campbell, for joining on this ordinance and on this hearing. And I think Councilor Edwards said it very well. This is a critical issue for our city, I think for any city to address, to make sure our employees, our departments are treated fairly, are not being harassed or discriminated against or retaliated against. But I am heartened to see someone that I think we all know and have worked with in the past as director of the Human Rights Commission, and we look forward to hearing more about how your role and your plans for this, and certainly the mayor's support on these issues, is going to address some of these concerns. I think the Commonwealth, in its wisdom, has given quite a lot of authority to local human rights commissions, and I'm sure you'll talk a little bit more about that, but the opportunity to investigate, to subpoena, to issue orders is critical. Because while we need to be measuring, we need to be talking about, we need to be reporting and disclosing issues, we also need to be remedying them as they occur and hopefully preventing future occurrences. So I think the goal of this legislation is quite clear. It's my understanding, as Councilor Edwards was saying, that the goals and the role of your office, Director, are very similar, and so I look forward to hearing that. But I do think, as chair of our Civil Rights Committee here on the council, a role I've been proud to have for several years, we need to continue pushing ourselves as a city, as an institution, as a community on these issues, and we need to be honest about that, even when those discussions can be somewhat uncomfortable. So I'm glad we're doing this. I want to thank the chair for holding this hearing, and look forward to hearing a little bit more about what your plans are. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Zakim, and also the third co-sponsor, City Council President Andrea Campbell, for an opening comment.
First of all, Evandro, good to see you. Thank you for being here, and congrats on the new role. I just want to thank Councilor Edwards and Councilor Zakim for the partnership and for their fierce advocacy, not only through the Civil Rights Committee for the council, but also with respect to some really troubling issues in various departments that have sometimes been very difficult to talk about, whether it's the fire department or other departments where we get complaints and concerns and don't necessarily move forward in a way that everyone thinks brings about accountability and justice. And so this was happy to join in partnership with them, look forward to a robust hearing, and also to see what the Human Rights Commission is doing that connects with this, and then continuing any conversation about how we strengthen it, and also get to I think the great merits of this proposed ordinance. So thank you, and thank you, Councilor Edwards and Councilor Zakim.
Thank you, and Evandro, welcome. Again, you have the floor as the Executive Director. If you can just give us your thoughts on behalf of the administration with respect to this ordinance.
Sure. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me. It was exciting when I saw the email to be here on this issue, which, to be honest, over the past several months, I was not aware of it to a certain extent, and I was not aware of the Human Rights Commission in neither. But I am encouraged not only to be here, what that signals for the city of Boston, what that means, that the mayor decided to restart this commission. I'm also very encouraged and want to thank the lead sponsors of this particular proposal because as all of you have alluded to, it's important that we continue to have this discussion about discrimination, about bias, about equity in our city, and to some extent we are having this discussion as a country, right? I think there's not a day that goes by that you don't see something in the news that alludes to this issue, right? And I can start by saying this as the new executive director of the Boston Human Rights Commission. This is my first time speaking before this body. I will be speaking, with your permission, with this body on a quarterly basis. That is contemplated. That is the ordinance as was written in 1984. To report and answer questions like this. So I do want to say that I'm looking forward to an ongoing basis coming here and reporting and getting feedback and continue the conversation on this matter. Now, discrimination in the workplace is certainly something that needs to be studied, something that, as I mentioned, not just in the city of Boston, but I think as a country, we need to improve upon, right? Before, though, I dive into the crux of why we're here, I wanted to, since I'm on the record, and albeit we all know each other, I did want to sort of give you some background information. I understand you probably know some parts of my story, but I wanted to kind of give you an overall sense of some relevant information that I think can help you see why I'm here today, why I'm in this particular position. As most of you probably already know this, I wasn't born in this country. I was born in Cape Verde Islands, and I came here, particularly to Boston and Dorchester at age 15. Didn't know a lick of English. Thankfully, with help of my mom and some teachers at BPS at Madison Park, I went to UMass Amherst in Western Massachusetts and studied legal studies and sociology with criminal justice concentration, as well as African American studies. That was one of the things minor that I had, and I graduated from UMass in 2004. And I mentioned that I was part of the Afro-Am studies because that to me was the genesis to how it led to me being here. I was studying the civil rights movement. I also studied workers' rights class with a professor who back then was the MCAD chair, actually. He was the MCAD, as we know, is the Massachusetts Against Discrimination Commission. So then from there, after UMass, I went to Howard University School of Law, and I went to Howard University School of Law for the legacy that he has. I went to that school because of folks like Targo Marshall, who we all know was the first black Supreme Court justice, who was a Howard alum. Charles Hamilton Houston, who we know at Harvard here, we have an institute that does work on his name. Those two men played a significant role in the development and establishing of the integration that happened during the civil rights movement in 1950s. They, in fact, Targo Marshall, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, argued the Board of Education cases that integrated the schools. So I start there to some extent to kind of give you a background of what brings me here, right? To say that in fact, one thing that Charles Hamilton used to say is that lawyers are either social engineers or social parasites. Some of you may be familiar with that, right? I'm 11 years out of law school. I feel almost seasoned to be, post 10 years out of law school. But I've always wanted to be an attorney that's going to use my legal skills to serve the public, because that's what these gentlemen did, right? So, but out of law school, I worked at a big law firm, which is a firm, actually a Boston firm as well. It's called Wilmer Hale. And I've spent 2.5 years there. I was part of the litigation group doing internal investigations and complex litigations involving big companies. Not to name any clients, but it'd be clients typically that you could, whether it was AT&T or Bank of America, some of these major corporations that we see on a daily basis. So I did that for 2.5 years. Then I decided I wanted to come home to Massachusetts, but I didn't want to work in big law. I wanted to be in a courtroom. I wanted to be in Roxbury. I wanted to be local, and I became assistant district attorney for Suffolk County DA, where I prosecuted cases from domestic violence to gun cases, some very serious charges, and tried cases, in fact, several cases before jury. But I also did cases that some of the other ADAs perhaps didn't want. They called paper cases, the cases that involve checks, the cases that involve frauds, right? The cases that involve potentially somebody stealing to work for a bank that stole from the bank, right? Those cases are not cut and dried. The witness said ABC. It involves reading documents, sometimes often discovery of several documents, right? And then I spent about a year almost at Liberty Mutual. I was in-house there and did civil litigation, attended in practice, whether it was mediation or arbitration or responding to interrogatories and requesting them and documents and such, right? I wanted to be a litigator. I wanted to be a good litigator in court, right? And the rest is sort of history in the sense that then I was elected state rep for 5 years on Beacon Hill and focused mostly on criminal justice reforms and civil rights and human rights issues, as well as immigration immigrant rights, right? So that's, and I say that in a sense to sort of give you the background on the record in terms of what I bring to the table that's relevant here, right? Which is someone that understands, the legal process, that understands that when you make decisions, particularly during investigation, that you have to be thoughtful, you have to be thorough, it has to be based on facts and the law, that you have, as all of you, in fact, are lawyers, and know the ethics that we all are bound by, right? So now, having said that, right, I then, as you know, actually, the mayor asked me to come and fill this position. And when I was having conversations with him, quite frankly, I didn't know. I didn't know this existed. And I was like, let me think about it. The first thing that I did when I got home was pull, because he mentioned the ordinance existed since 1984. And I can, it depends on, feel free to ask me questions as I go as well, or you can wait to the end. But I don't want to give too much information or not enough, but at the same time, I want to get to the crux of why we're here, okay? Which is the Human Rights Commission, at least why I'm here, right? Because I'm the new ED of the Human Rights Commission, which was, as I started to say, has been around since 1984. It's in the chapter 12, section 9 of the Boston Municipal Code, and it was designed, in fact, if you read closely, the first line in it, it says, the ordinance was designed to assure that every resident shall have equal access to and benefit from all public services. Now, apparently when it was first started back in the 80s, it was heavily brought forward because the city wanted to do something in regards to gay rights, as you know, even though it is what it is now. Back then, that wasn't the case. So the focus was to sort of to protect the LGBTQ residents of the city. Now, what happened with it or not, I'm not here to discuss that to some extent because I really don't know really how it went dormant. But I do know that the mayor, as I think Council Edwards alluded to earlier, one mentioned it in his speech early in the year, and then I eventually, at some time during the summers when he called me, and that was the first time I had heard about it, right? Now, and he did want to focus on immigrant rights, particularly, and I think goes without saying as to why that is the case. We have a federal administration now that's been, very, very, very aggressively targeting immigrant communities throughout the country. We've seen an influx of ICE agents, and almost every day, to some extent, you hear the same issues are popping up with raids happening, check-ins are happening somewhere or not, right? So, but I can tell you this though, that the ordinance itself, it's a broad anti-discrimination policy. It specifically prohibits discrimination against anyone in the city of Boston in the areas of employment, labor, education, public accommodations and services. It also has credit transactions and banking and insurance industry prohibitions.
Evandro,
Sure.
Can you explain for the public what's the process by which someone can file a complaint with the current Human Rights Commission, and if any, what public process occurs around that complaint? So
I guess the question kind of takes me fast forward, right? At this point, we're not taking any applications because it's me, right? As you know, in order to do any, not applications, excuse me, complaints and investigations I can't do the investigations alone until there is the challenge to some extent, as well as the benefit of being in my position now is that everything has to start from scratch, right? The procedures of how the investigation is going to happen, how the complaints are gonna be coming in, how how the intake is going to happen, how the investigation is going to proceed through the process, right? So, but this to some extent is all in the ordinance, right? It envisions a full hearing potentially before. Go ahead.
No. So, yeah, sorry, we are correct in understanding that we cannot file, there's no filing at this particular moment. because you're setting up the infrastructure. That's your job,
Right.
right? Okay.
As you probably know, I'm 2 months into it,
Yeah.
into the
So-
job.
So my question for
Sure.
you is, and what I understand this conversation to be, again, is to make this come to life, this HRC to come to life. So part of this is the partnership we're going to form. And so along with the infrastructure that you set up, and that's why also we have some folks coming in on the panel who work in discrimination to give also suggestions.
Right.
But one thing I'd love to hear in the next, I don't know, we're probably not going to have a working session maybe this year, but as this conversation continues, is your timeline for having set up and being able to receive ideally paper and electronic complaints in more
course.
than one language. Also, what I'm not clear about, and maybe we need a smaller, I mean, could we get more lawyers in the room, because that'd be helpful, right? But if we could get a conversation, I mean, I think there's a real, I'm genuinely confused based on the language that we have here. What is the jurisdiction of this agency? Is it just about people having access to city services equitably? Or when I look at some of the language that talks about, it says it shall be further unlawful practice for any employment agency. So that's something for us to figure out.
So-
Is it any employer in the city of Boston, regardless of whether the city has to comply with this?
Exactly. That's my
That's wonderful.
that's my reading of it. That not only does it apply to private sector and private individuals in the capacity of putting out a public service, right? That is, if someone owns a restaurant, if someone is, has a barber shop and is hiring, and it also encompasses. In fact, I'm not sure exactly
I think
which
it's
language
great.
you were talking to, but
So I apologize. That's I've been a counselor too long. I know better than to not cite what I'm talking about.
But if I may direct you to Section 1, Section 2, actually, the definitions, right? Definitions of,
It's section 12-9.3, discriminatory practices regarding employment.
right. So,
And then
so when I read that,
the second paragraph in that.
right, so when I read that, right, it said, it shall be unlawful practice and deemed a violation of the chapter for a person, right? That first line of that, of Section 3, 9.3,
9.3, it shall be unlawful practice and thereby deemed in violation of this chapter for any employment agency.
no, you see the first one. It shall, chapter 3, 9.3, right? Is that where you are?
This is funny. We have a printout of it from our website. It's not the
Right,
same
so-
with the written one right now.
Okay, so let's put it this way. And to some extent, a lot of this, as you mentioned, I think we have to carry on the conversation to hammer out some of the details. The way I read it, that section, and most of the other sections, it said that, again, that that essentially prohibit any person from discriminating in employment, in that section. That's how I read it. Then I look at to what do they mean by person, right? Which is why I was alluding to the definitions, right? The definition says, not only does it include individuals and partnerships and corporations and agencies and such, then he goes on to say, also the city and also political subdivisions, right?
Correct.
So I read it as,
I think that's great.
Right.
I'm very happy about that expansive reading and understanding how powerful this tool is to fight discrimination in the city of Boston. But again, just making sure that we're clear on that to prevent any other, lawsuits or legal challenges to that.
Okay.
The other thing that I don't know if it's a task force or again a working session that we should be discussing is whether we want to be as consistent with the state. I know our filing deadlines are different. We're, I think, 180 days. You have 300 days
yes, 60,
with the state. The state just passed pregnancy discrimination. We don't have that yet here. So these are all suggestions about how we're going to make this as best as possible. So.
Right, one of the things that the ordinance contemplates, and it's clear in there, is that we're going to have to work with the MCAD and the EOC almost on a daily basis. I have taken steps to meet with the authorities, particularly at MCAD, to discuss how we're going to function together, right? But there's a lot work to be done.
Excited.
I can tell you, to add on to some of the things I was saying earlier, is that in the ordinance, before we even go public with this is our process, we have to come before this body again for public comments. So there's a lot of, again, literally on a quarterly basis,
basis.
I will be here. But one of the processes also requires that before the procedures and rules are published, the government, that sets up how everything's going to happen in the office, that we come here for public discussion of it. So, I'm looking forward to that point as well. I can tell you, to sort of move on the discussion a little bit, we are in the process of, identify commissioners, and hopefully by the end of the month, the commissioners will be appointed. So the commissioners are a big portion of this, right? The ED, as ED, I'm saying myself as executive director, and the staff, is the way that it's designed is that the ED determines probable cause of whether, to begin, whether the case is liable or not, right? The PC, which all of you lawyers know, is just the basics to get in, and then hopefully try to resolve the matter. As you know, this is an alternative dispute resolution body, right? So the part of it is to try to mediate and resolve issues. And then there's contemplated hearings before commissioners to determine if we can't resolve a matter, to determine what happens next. Sure.
I guess two questions. The first is just a point of clarification for people watching.
Sure.
For the committee, because technically the ordinance before this committee is having to do with the ordinance to establish this independent commission that Councilor Zakem, Edwards, and I contemplated.
Right.
We filed this in January, though, of this year. The commission's revived after that. So clearly, these two are very much connected. So the hearing can't, of course, just be about the Human Rights Commission. It
Right.
has to, of course, be about this docket. So I guess my first question, and then I have one other question. My first question is, how do you envision, based on how you see the Human Rights Commission being revitalized and revamped, connecting with the ordinance, proposed ordinance that's before the committee, being incorporated into what you're doing with the Human Rights Commission?
I can tell you this much, is based on my review of it, of the proposal. The Human Rights Commission and this proposal are going for the same policy and the same goals, achieving the same thing, which is the Human Rights Commission obviously goes beyond that. That's not just an employment setting, but it's embedded essentially the same task is there for the Human Rights Commission to do.
So, I look forward, obviously, to some pieces of the conversation, seeing how we can incorporate the proposed ordinance within the conversation with revitalizing the Human Rights Commission. And then the second question is, and it goes back to Councilor Edwards' question around timeline. So right now, it's just you. Do you have a budget?
I can tell you this much. I am working
Outside,
with,
I'm assuming you're getting paid, but do you have a budget for the, yeah?
I wouldn't be otherwise. I'll tell you this much. I'm in the process of talking to, in the middle of that process, essentially with the Office of Budget, I believe it's called, OBM, right? I'm trying to get my acronyms together. So it's coming, right, in terms of how the office is going to look like, how, what kind of budget it has.
So you're still developing budget, commissioners, staff to join you as executive director, all of that.
All of that.
And by the end of this year, the hope is that you will have maybe some staff, commissioners, and a budget?
To a certain extent, yes. That by the end of my plan, to a certain extent, is to, if I want to be frank, is to early 2020 to be operable.
Okay.
To be in
when you say
operation.
early, January, March?
To be honest, we're going into,
Okay.
as you know, in December and so on. I don't want to put a start timeline on it, but at least during the first quarter, sometime towards the end of the first quarter.
Okay.
But
that would be helpful. just continued updates so we can let the public know, because this is a good thing, right? The Human Rights Commission being brought back, given the level of of responsibility that it covers and what can be accomplished within it, incorporating, of course, the ideas within the independent commission that we are thinking about.
Right.
But then, you know, there are folks out there, particularly who think they can go straight to you, go here, file complaints. And these are current city employees who are dealing with promotional issues at various departments. I have some in my district, longtime city employees concerned around unfairness with respect to promotions. They go to their union, they feel like their union is not hearing them. They feel like they have no place to go. So there is this idea out in the public space that they can just go to you or others to file a complaint. So if we could put something out there in terms of timeline and what still needs to be done before we get to that point, would be really helpful.
Okay.
But I
No.
just wanted to make the clarification on the proposed ordinance as well, that it the goal is to incorporate the two, and that's why we're also here with that docket, that it's not just about your commission.
Right,
Just
I mean,
to be
I'll
clear,
get
to the
to-
not for, I'm just saying for the public.
Right,
Thank you.
right. I can tell you this. I've taken this responsibility very serious. It's to an extent. Sometimes you say, you know, stars align, right? This right here is monumental. That we do it right. So I am cognizant of the time, and I want to get it up and running as soon as possible. At the same time, everything has to be done from scratch, right? So, and I want to be as thorough as possible. I'm working with the law department. I'm working with different departments within the city to make sure I'm learning, you know, the different offices that exist, whether it's the Office of Labor Relations or what HR does. And so a lot of what I've been doing is trying to learn the city and its infrastructure and how we're going to work together. But I do want to get this up and running as soon as possible to benefit the people of Boston. But also, we also have seen so many incidents when there's a launch, the glitches, right? So I'm trying to avoid those. I'm trying to get a process that's thorough, that you can be proud of, that we all can be proud of, that can serve the city of Boston and its residents for generations. That's really the back of my mind as well, right? That this is not about now. This is about how do we set up an infrastructure that can sustain the time.
Very good. Councilor Zakhem, any comments at this point? Very good. So, Ivana, we have a second panel that has time. We have some time sensitivity, so we're just going to ask if you can stay with us in the gallery, if you wouldn't mind, when we get to the second panel. Rebecca
Sure.
Pontax, I know is here.
And thank you for taking the time.
Very good. Lauren Sampson, who's an attorney with Civil Rights Fellow, Lawyers for Civil Rights. And I know that Tanisha, I do not see Tanisha, but I know Tanisha Sullivan, president of Boston's NAACP. I know she was invited. I think she had a scheduling conflict. She may be joining us later, so I want to thank her for the great work she does on behalf of the NAACP, and hopefully she'll have a chance to join us or send in some comments. But with that, both Rebecca and Lauren, welcome to the Boston City Council, and if you could just state your name and affiliation and for the record, and you have the floor to give us your thoughts on this proposal.
My name is Rebecca Ponticus. I am a civil litigator. I handle employment plaintiffs' claims. My office is right across the street. I have a particular focus on gender issues, including something that I call family responsibilities discrimination. That is a term that encompasses discrimination against moms and dads who are caring for kids, or children who are caring for their older parents who may have dementia or some sort of care needs at their end of their lives. Some of the claims involve stereotyping, so we see a lot of employers who make assumptions about what a proper woman would do who has children, or a proper man would do who has children. So I bring a lot of claims based on those sorts of issues, as well as associational discrimination claims for people who are associated with somebody with a disability and maybe need to care for that person and face penalties in work because of that. So that's a little bit of background on my practice. I also sit as the co-chair of the amicus committee for the Massachusetts Employment Lawyers Association. MELA is an association of plaintiffs' employment lawyers, and we do a lot of advocacy both on Beacon Hill and through the courts on behalf of employees' rights. So that's my background, who I am, and and I'll explain to you a little bit once. I'll let my colleague here introduce herself, and then I'll explain to you how I got here and why I'm here.
Thank you. I'm Lauren Sampson. I'm the Civil Rights Fellow at Lawyers for Civil Rights, formerly the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. We foster equal opportunity and fight discrimination on behalf of people of color and immigrants through creative and courageous legal action, education, and advocacy in collaboration with law firms and community partners. We have clients across Massachusetts and surrounding communities in 9 impact areas, including and particularly employment discrimination.
Very good. Any of my colleagues have any questions?
She had
Oh,
some
you want to follow
testimony
up?
on
Very good.
I was going to say, I'm here to talk about an experience I had about 8 years ago when I wanted to use the Boston Human Rights Commission. As part of my practice, I got an update that talked a lot about local ordinances that have specific protections for parents. Because what that does in the employment law context, or in family responsibilities discrimination context, is that it actually makes cases where parents are penalized easier to prove. You can certainly bring stereotyping claims, but they involve a lot of discovery, a lot of issues of proof, and a lot of places in the litigation where an employer can make things drag out, where the employer can muddy the waters and just make it very difficult to prove. And your ordinance has in it specific protections for people who are parents of minor children or disabled children who are not minors. That goes beyond our state law as currently put together. And I also wanted to note that this, which was constructed in 1984, actually had gender identity and expression in it decades before the public was talking about it. So this is a very forward-looking ordinance. I had someone from a national network that I am involved with referred to me because this national network had done the research, and I found out through them about this ordinance in the city of Boston. We're only one of 3 municipalities that have this sort of an ordinance. The other 2 are Cambridge and Medford. And she wanted to enforce her rights under the statute. She worked for a large entity that was within the city of Boston. And when she got some new supervisors who found out that she had new small children who had asthma and pneumonia, she found herself stripped of her duties, disciplined, and ultimately fired after she complained about being discriminated against. So I looked into bringing something before the Boston Human Rights Commission, and it took a very long time to even get a copy of the ordinance, and I was ultimately told that the commission was defunct and they were not accepting complaints. So I took my client to the Commission Against Discrimination at the state level. Now, I can't bring at the Commission Against Discrimination a complaint under the Boston City Ordinance. The Human Rights Commission in Boston can certainly refer such a complaint and have the commission handle it, but the commission's jurisdiction does not involve any sort of city ordinances like this, so it was not available to her. So I brought a stereotyping claim instead. It was, as I said, a much more difficult type of claim to bring, and unfortunately it was dismissed. She opted not to then move on to another stage where she might have had some other rights. But I think this illustrates the importance of having this Human Rights Commission, and it's particularly where you have an ordinance that's much more expansive than the state law, because at least I think as her lawyer and as her advocate, that she had a very clear case of being discriminated against based on the fact that she was a parent. As soon as her children started having health problems, she was told by her supervisor, oh, you know, I'm praying for you and your kids. Oh, you know, I'm taking these responsibilities away from you. No, I'm not doing it because you have kids. But, you know, this suddenly happened after issues arose with her children, so the timing of that makes these disclaimers look a little bit suspicious. This woman had no children herself. She was actually not even in Boston. She was in Austin, Texas. And so you put all of these things together, and it looked fairly clear to me that this woman's parental responsibilities were a driving force in behind why, after a decade at this company, she suddenly couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. I do have a couple of suggestions in terms of following up with Councilor Edwards' thoughts about expanding the ordinance. The state currently has a 300-day statute of limitations time limit to sue. I think it would behoove you to think about that. There are also discussions going on with respect to the state law about expanding it even beyond that, potentially to 2 or 3 years.
Can I ask you why 300? What's
300 days, we expanded to 300 days because you're going to have to bear with me here. This is going to get a little wonky. But under federal law, if a state has a state-level human rights commission like the Commission Against Discrimination, you have 300 days to bring the complaint to the EEOC. So what we did was we said, you know what, why have 180 days in Massachusetts when you get this expanded period under federal law? Why don't we just make them both uniform? So that's what we did.
Gotcha.
So now they're both the same, everybody's the same. You don't sort of lose your state rights before you lose your federal rights. There's another little dance in there. It gets even wonkier than that. I won't get into it, but we wanted to basically make them the same. And now we're talking about making it actually even greater than that, because it's 180 days, while 6 months might seem like a long time as we're all sitting here in this chamber. For somebody who's in the actual employment arena and who has to maybe find a new job, maybe worried about filing something that would potentially impede their job search process, 6 months isn't a very long time, especially if we're in a downturn of an economy where it might take you 6 months to find a new job. So it's not a very long time. Frankly, 300 days isn't a very long time. If you make a demand on a company to try and resolve the matter, or on a public entity to try and resolve the matter, the wheels can move slowly. And so you find yourself up against a time limit and you've got to file, which your client may not really want to do, but you don't really have a choice. So we're talking about expanding it even beyond 300 days at the state level. And I think there are bills pending right now in the state legislature to expand the statute of limitations under Chapter 151B to as long as 6 years. So I think it's critical when you're having this conversation with the Human Rights Commission to look at that statute of limitations.
Yep.
Second point is that, as Councilor Edwards pointed out, pregnancy is not specifically listed as a protected class. I think it should be.
Absolutely.
Well, and we've also just expanded the state law to require accommodations for pregnant women. And I think that's also critically important because under federal law, pregnancy is not considered a disability unless it's doing something else that's a disabling condition. But there are lots of things that pregnant women experience that they may need some sort of small accommodation for that they're not going to be considered disabled, so they won't get them. And then they end up getting fired as a result. I had someone come to me who pushed very heavy carts as part of her job as a cleaner in one of the local hospitals. Her supervisor, when she got pregnant, told her she should be able to push heavier carts because now she's 2 people, and proceeded to then give her those sorts of duties to the point where she just felt she had to quit because she was endangering her pregnancy.
I just want to, not because I'm pregnant, but inject, and I was really happy Councilor Edwards brought that up, but just last week was having, it came up in one of our departments, someone who is pregnant and was having trouble with a supervisor with respect to public accommodation, desk work, and was told, sorry, you're going to have to go home, and pushed back and said, no, I know my rights, and then it was resolved in a good way. But you can only imagine it has to come up with other employees, so I appreciate you just elaborating on that.
I think it comes up quite a bit, and I will tell you the dynamic that I think fuels it, particularly in very physical types of jobs. These managers are rather low level. They've got metrics to meet. They've got to get things done. There's a lot of algorithms that are now being employed in many workplaces, and they've got to meet their metrics. And if they don't, they're out. And quite frankly, these people are not either paid enough or at a high enough level to figure out how to deal with a woman who's pregnant and can't do the job as it's constructed. That's got to come from corporate. And the only way it's going to come from corporate is if there's a law telling corporate that corporate's got to deal with it. Otherwise, it's very easy to leave it to the line managers because sometimes these jobs are relatively low skill and they know they can get somebody like that. So it's just much easier to tell someone to go home and come back when you're not pregnant anymore. I wanted to actually put in one other plug that I've seen the Commission Against Discrimination doing when they got their extra funding for the sexual harassment uptick. They have put in the T advertisements that say, your rights can be remedied here. Here's our website. Here's where you go. If you want to really roll this out, I would suggest putting in the budget a rollout for some sort of mass kind of advertising like that. There's right outside, you've got those big towers with all the stuff on them. I'm sure we can convince the owners of those to put up in the public interest something that says, you know, we've got a commission now where you can come to, here's where you can go. And I would also suggest making sure that any sort of online accessibility is able to be accessed on like a smartphone or a tablet, because people that are consuming their internet now, particularly like kind of the younger generation, this is how they're getting it, not on a desktop. So something that they can download and fill out like by tapping on that is going to be, I think, very critical for that next generation that the executive director talked about.
I have a question specifically about jurisdiction. So we're dealing with 3 different levels of discrimination protection. We have the federal, we have the state, and we have the city of Boston. So in order for discrimination laws to apply at the federal level, you need, what, 50 employees?
Title VII requires 15 plus.
15.
And I think that carries over to both the Age Discrimination and Employment Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think you might be thinking of the Family and Medical Leave Act.
Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
So blanket, it's 15.
It's 15.
State, you require 6.
Right.
Unless you're a domestic worker, where you do not. That doesn't apply to you.
Right.
We did that. Sorry. And then, but the city of Boston, from the interpretation of the language right here, would apply to any employer, it seems. Is that your understanding too? I'm excited for that, but
So I think that's true, but then it does say in the definitional section, except that it shall not include any employer with 6 or less persons in its employ.
So it's consistent with the state.
It seems like there's two
Okay.
kind of, because it also says any, but then it says less than 6. My guess is that a court interpreting it would say, well, if it was qualified later, we're going to have to go with the qualification.
okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, very good. Lauren, anything additional?
Yes, so we come at this from the perspective in particular of an organization that litigates a great deal against both private and public employers. And one thing I certainly wanted to note, given the history of discrimination, is particularly systemic discrimination in the Boston Fire and Water Departments, is also add in a note about some of our experiences with the Boston Police Departments. For example, earlier this year, we're engaged in litigation entitled Figueroa v. BPD on behalf of 2 women of color civilian employees, in which we identified a pattern and practice of failing to promote candidates of color and discriminatorily distributing overtime hours. We've also had to this year file a public records lawsuit against the BPD regarding their employment practices and seeking to compel future compliance with the public records law, as this has been an ongoing issue for LCR for several years. We also note that in the last couple weeks, the SJC ruled in BPD v. Gannon, a case in which we had submitted amicus support, that the hair test is an insufficient basis for failing to hire applicants, and that in our ongoing case against the City of Boston, Jones, we continue to challenge the hair test as discriminatory and unreliable. And I mention that just to kind of flag that for LCR and for, I think, a lot of civil rights organizations, when we talk about systemic discrimination in employment, we're not simply looking at hiring and firing, but also things like the allocation of overtime hours, how individuals are promoted, and how they're treated and regarded in their departments. So 3 proposals / questions that I guess we have as part of the ordinance and the structure of the commission. We're very supportive of the proposal to include a variety of different voices on the commission and to allow both appointees and applicants. We wanted to encourage the city, though, to identify individuals with experience conducting interviews and working with vulnerable individuals on sensitive topics, and to invest in training and orientation for the commission to ensure its success. We have seen, and I'm sure my colleague has seen as well, a lot of workplace investigations that just re-victimize the complainant, where individuals don't have training in things like trauma-informed investigation or implicit bias. And we certainly say in this case, let's not set folks up to fail, but instead provide those kind of resources and support to ensure that investigations are conducted with sensitivity and with awareness. We also believe that in order for the commission to be effective, it should enjoy a broader scope of authority with the ability to compel or solicit employer cooperation. And so want to ensure that there are mechanisms to incentivize supervisors and line managers who contribute to structural discrimination to participate and to think about the kind of weight that a request from the commission to participate will carry. We also are interested in the possibility that the commission, like say the Attorney General, can have an affirmative as well as responsive role. So taking the initiative to initiate investigations into systemic discrimination absent a complainant. Even though the MCAD is technically empowered to do this, we've noted that over the past several years that's just not something that they've done. And this is, I think, an opportunity for the commission to take on that more aggressive and affirmative role in seeking out and rooting out systemic discrimination, especially in industries where employees feel like they can't speak up, particular employees in industries that have a lot of folks who are undocumented or otherwise are low-wage workers. The final step relates in particular to the public records request regarding the degree to which investigative documents are going to be made available to the public. We note that, of course, there's a desire for community transparency, but also note there's a need to provide victims and whistleblowers with confidentiality as well as protection for retaliation. And so just encourage the city to think about how exactly these documents, these interviews, these notes, these transcripts will be shielded from the public records law, and also to what degree that needs to occur in order to, again, find that balance between privacy for individual complainants, victims, and whistleblowers, but also ensuring the city meets its obligations under that law. We are, of course, happy to continue to work with the city to address systemic bias, and I just wanted to stress that we continue to be available for testimony, commentary, and so on and so forth.
I have one thing to add to something my colleague just said, because it was very interesting when she was talking about training, and she's talking about trauma-informed training. In addition to trauma-informed training, something that I have noticed both in private investigations, but also sometimes when I'm at the commission, is that people are employed to try and mediate or conciliate a complaint without any real understanding about the complainant's background, the type of job the complainant does, and how to communicate with that person. For example, I was recently at a conciliation where a very well-meaning conciliator at the commission began by explaining to us that he was trying to explain the limitations on a he said, she said evidentiary type of situation. But the way he communicated it to my client, who was not an English speaker, it made it sound to her like, if you have a sexual harassment claim, you better have a witness or you're out of luck. So I would also encourage that when we're communicating with the public about this, we try to get the legalese out as much as possible. And as a lawyer, I can be just one of the worst offenders. It's hard when you're in the profession and you've got a lingo that you speak in. But something that really was thrown into relief for me that day was that, because this individual he was very well-meaning, and he was trying to explain something to her that can be a complicated legal concept. But to her, it just sounded like, oh, well, I don't have any witnesses, so I have no case. And so I think that there's sort of two levels of communication. One is the trauma-informed and the ethnic and racially sensitive one, but I think also we've got like an economic, kind of situational type of communication that's I think equally as important, because people think that, well, unless I've got a witness, I have no evidence. Mm-hmm. And I spend a lot of my time explaining to people, well, you do have evidence. You have a complaint that the defendant may want to fight for a long time about because they think their person is more credible, but you don't not have evidence. And that's been bothering me a lot for many years.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Councilor Zachem, you're okay with that? Very good.
Thank you very much for this
Appreciate
opportunity.
your,
I look forward to continuing this
appreciate your,
conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate you participating.
Is that your
today.
testimony?
Yes, I gave a copy
Okay.
to Joel.
Perfect, yep, we have a copy of it, good.
Okay, excellent.
And at this time, if there's anyone wishing to offer public testimony, may do so now or forever hold your peace. Seeing and hearing no additional desire for public testimony, that will close the public testimony portion and throw it over to my colleagues for just a final comment on it and sort of next steps. So something that you think that may require maybe a working session in the very near future. Is that my understanding?
Yes, so, and I know that there's been some confusion by the public with what was noticed and what we discussed.
Right.
So I wanted to address that and
That'd be great.
specifically break down why this discussion was completely relevant to what we filed. First, when we filed this hearing order, it was January, I would say early January.
29.
And so I was a week or less or so after the state of the city, or maybe at the same time. It may have even been at the same time. So we weren't aware when we drafted and filed this that the HRC was coming back. So for the public's understanding, we did not know that this tool that had been dormant was coming back. So it was an attempt to try and figure out how we're going to deal with ongoing investigations, since we disagreed with how the one investigation had gone forward. So we were trying to come up with an institutional answer. That is what we filed, an institutional answer to investigate city departments. So I just want to be clear. So part of this conversation is looking at what we already have as a tool with the Human Rights Commission and what we filed. And so turns out there's a lot of what we filed is already existing. It's now the city's time with the city council, with our advocates, to make it come to life. And so here are the major differences that I see between, or the major points in how it's addressed or not addressed in the HRC. First of all, jurisdiction. In the filed suggested ordinance by myself and my colleagues, our jurisdiction was just limited to city departments and investigating those departments and concerns. The HRC actually has a larger jurisdiction, is actually going to impact more people. That's existing law. With regards to investigation, both have investigatory powers. The powers of the executive director are actually more expansive than expected of the 7 commissioners on the proposed ordinance. Both have a proposal for 7 commissioners. The filed version is asking for the commissioners to be partially appointed by the city council. The current commissioners are all appointed by the mayor. The other major difference is, of course, we did not lay out any specific categories of individuals to be protected. It was just to enforce what we thought was the state discrimination laws, and we didn't realize how expansive the city already had protection. So in many of the major cruxes of the ordinance are already provided for in the current Human Rights Commission. So that is why we invited the new executive director, who was not hired at the time, the commission was not functioning at the time, to come in and talk about, and thank you so much, Executive Director Carvalho, for coming in to break down how the two actually marry each other. We invited then Attorney Ponticus and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights to come in to further break down how the HRC and this ordinance together we can fill in additional gaps to make them come to life and to really make it accessible to Bostonians. So I wanted to wrap up with that clarification. This is a great conversation. We are actually all on the same team trying to make this come to fruition as soon as possible.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification, because I was actually receiving feedback. There was some confusion as to
I know.
which matter we were addressing or talking to. So, and I appreciate Ivano Cavallo's involvement as well as the first panel. And final comments from Council President?
First of all, again, thank you to Councilor Zakem and Councilor Edwards and Councilor Flaherty for making sure this hearing happened today. I just lost my, one of the things that I have to stress, because I got a lot of emails from constituents in my district, not only excited about this hearing proceeding and finally having the conversation, and excited about the Human Rights Commission coming back online, but the issue around pregnancy has come up, but promotions within departments or lack thereof, specifically for employees of color, is a real issue. We hear it quite a bit, whether it is police, public works, parks department. We have documented cases from folks who have been working for the city for a very long time, who feel like the process is unfair or that there isn't any process. And what they see as a recourse is going to their union, and they have found that sometimes the union is not helpful to them. So I want to stress that, because we have gotten a lot of calls, follow-up calls over the years from several employees in my district, wanting them to know this is important to us. We have had, as much as I may advocate for them to be promoted, a body, an independent body or commission needs to be available to these employees to be able to go to have someone who will understand but also take action to hold departments and individuals accountable. It doesn't mean necessarily firing anyone, but ensuring that processes are in place for promotion, that it is fair, that it is reasonable, and that people who have been working for this city for a very long time have the opportunity to be promoted, to earn more money, serve their families, of course. And so I just had to put that on the record as something that we've heard quite a bit. Thank you again, Councilor Edwards, Councilor Zakem, central staff, but also our respective teams for making this happen today.
And final comment to Councilor Zakem, one of the co-sponsors.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank my good colleagues, Councilors Edwards and Campbell, for their leadership on this, and just really, say I'm heartened by Evangelo Carvalho being here in that role and his, I think, proactive attitude and desire to move this along. And it is important. I want to thank Councilor Edwards for explaining sort of the distinctions between what was filed and what some part of the discussion was today. And the HRC is a powerful tool, and it's important, one, that employees of the city and residents of the city know that it's available to them, because there are different avenues. And I think people who are experiencing discrimination or harassment at work are going to have different levels of comfort with how they address it, whether it's talking to a direct superior, whether it's talking to a lateral colleague, whether it's going to one of these agencies or the MCAD or the EOC or here in the HRC or some other body. It's really critical. And we need to, the title of this was about systemic bias. And when there are individual instances that perhaps don't, as a single instance, seem that it's a big problem or see that there's discrimination happening or bias occurring, when we look at things as a whole, we can see patterns, and we need to see how we have to be proactive as legislators, as residents, as people in public service. So I just want to say I'm thrilled to have this conversation. This conversation has to keep happening. I don't think anyone's here looking to find wrongdoing or misbehavior, but we need to be thinking of ways we're going to measure our progress, that folks who do feel they've been wronged have an avenue that's comfortable. The discussions about confidentiality and how we're going to put this in place. The work I did with our former colleague, Congresswoman Presley, on the City Council's own harassment and reporting policy. These are all things we just have to be very deliberate about, and it's easy to get lost in the shuffle. So I want to thank the chairman as well for holding this hearing, for moving this forward, Mayor Walsh and his team for really rejuvenating the HRC, and I look forward to continuing this work. So thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Councilor Zakem, and my colleagues here for attending, and for the panels for participating, for the public for being here as well. And that will conclude the hearing with respect to docket 0188, an ordinance relative to the establishment of an independent commission on equal opportunity and the elimination of systemic bias in the workplace. The Committee on Government Operations is adjourned.